Hi, this is Megan with Have Will We Will Travel, and today we're going to do a tutorial, little preview for the duplicate stitch class. And one of the things that we're going to cover in that class is picking out a shape to do, but this is a sample of what the duplicate stitch could look like when it's done. It was, the pink was applied after knitting the swatch. So the pattern that it will be sent out in the email before the class will advise you to create a swatch, something that we can do the duplicate stitch on top of. In this case, it was just like kind of like a 5x5 or 4x4, I think, swatch of stockinette. So that's knitting on the right side and purling on the back. And then just give you a little look of what the duplicate stitch looks like on the back. It's not unlike cross stitch. So you'll see the where the fibers kind of interweave in the back, so it won't be completely invisible, but you can do your best to mitigate how crazy you get with your ends when you're doing this. It's good to think sequentially when you're trying to work up your design. So the pattern has a heart shape that is very much like this one. And but I've also included some blank charts in case you wanted to do something like a zigzag or border that's just like straight lines, or star shapes, whatever you want to do. One thing to think of if you're going to design your own stuff, or you're looking for inspiration, is pixelated art or cross stitch are great sources of inspiration, because essentially you're going to be applying the yarn in very much like a pixelized or a cross stitch way. So unless you want to get really fancy and try to do half stitches or something like that, you're pretty much always going to have like a V that covers the V that we've already got in the swatch when it was originally knitted. Okay, so that is what we're going to be doing. Put that to the side. And for this class, you will want to have a gauge swatch already knitted up in stockinette. You can use any type of yarn you have on hand. You don't have to use what it calls for in the pattern, but if you're using something bigger, sometimes it's a little easier to start out with to see the how all of the yarn interweaves here to create your stockinette stitch, and then how you apply the color over it. And this is a chunky weight yarn that I'm using, and then my contrast color is going to be this pink. And you will need a tapestry needle, also like your yarn needle. So this one is a silver one that's just got a head big enough for the yarn to go through. You can also use something like the plastic kind, as long as this needle will fit through your fabric that you've created here in your gauge swatch without pulling at it too much. You're good to go. And you want to be sure that the head's big enough for your size yarn that you're using to go through it. So in this case, I'm using the exact kind of fiber, chunky yarn to go over chunky yarn. You can get really fancy and have fun with this and make kind of art yarns work for you, something fluffy or multiple strands of, say, like something very thin, mohair, something like that. When you're going into this, the creativity abounds. You can do whatever you want. But basically, the duplicate stitch is pretty simple. Our goal is to repeat this kind of stitch to cover it with another color. I mean, that's really what we're doing here. So when you're looking at your gauge swatch, the first thing you want to do is kind of look at the anatomy. On the back, it's all garter, really looking very wavy, but you have a V here. And you can pull apart your yarn just a little bit if you want, but like where you have a V, this is basically a loop that's underneath another loop that's underneath another loop. If you want to kind of see where these two strands are going to be in the back, you can flip this over and you can kind of see how it's between these sets of rows. So the important thing is to try and figure out which loops are woven into the other ones. So like if you tried to do these two together, they would actually technically be separate stitches. So you want to try and work with the one that is looped in underneath here and makes just like one loop like that. It'll make more sense when I'm going to use my yarn. Okay, so just like with cross stitch, you're going to want to be conscious of where your ends are, and not, like I said, not zigzagging all over. So you're probably going to want to try and find the middle of your pattern, or like an edge that you can build off of kind of subtly to make more you know, lines of color, rather than like starting here and then jumping over there, you know, roundabout. That just might make your life easier, but it's not, it's just something that comes with time, you know, and your personal preference, how you want to do it. So I'm just going to grab, just to get started, I'm going to work in this line here. So I'm going to bring my needle, got a little tail on there so I can help weave this in. So I'm leaving the tail, and I've just got it on my ball over here that's flying around outside of the camera. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up into the stitch from the back to the front. I'm going to poke out my needle, and this ends up being between the two rows. I can tell that because like to either side, this one is really like kind of interwoven here instead of like the other. So I'm going to reposition my needle, make sure I'm trying to come up in between, in the row, in between these two V stitches. I'm going to pull this up, and where we're going with this, the next position of the needle, is this yarn goes underneath this leg of the one stitch above it and this leg. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and insert my needle underneath the first leg and then the second leg and pull through very delicately, because you want to try not to be too tight here, because you want to try and match the gauge that you're going on to, so that it provides maximum coverage. Okay, so now I've covered the first half. Then I'm going to go right back down where I started, and then delicately pull the, oops. See, I stabbed through my yarn. This can happen, that's why it's pulling on itself. And try and minimize that. Okay, so when all goes well, you have this little V here that covers the V of the stitch. Okay, so you can tug a little bit if you need to make sure your tension's correct. So I keep tugging on the wrong thing here. This one, that's where I want. Okay. Okay, so we have dotted color. So I'm going to go into the next, I'm going to do a row of these. So I'm going to bring my needle up from the back to the front, and I'm going to go behind one stem and then the second stem of the stitch above it. I can turn it to show you. I'm going to pull it through, and then back down into the back, making sure not to stab through your yarn already, so we don't have that same problem. Okay, so now adjusting for a little bit of tension, which also helps use that when you're blocking. We have two stitches where I've applied the pink yarn to cover the original stockinette stitch. All right, we're just going to do a couple more here. And if you're going to do a lot of stitches, you'll probably want to make sure that you work really long. You have more yarn off of the ball, so that you're not kind of doing what I'm doing, which is, you know, losing your tail. But as long as you leave yourself enough tail to wind in, you should be fine. Okay, so I'm going to go here in the middle of the stitch, making sure I'm kind of on the same row. I'm going to take my needle and insert it under one stem and then the second stem. I can switch hands to show how this pulls through more carefully. And then we're going to go down where we originally pulled up. And we have another stitch. Okay, and we're going to do that one more time. We're going to, I'm going to use this with my right hand because I am not very ambidextrous. So we're going to, on the same line of stitches, we're going to go up through the middle of one of these stitches, insert needle underneath one stem, and then the second stem of the stitch above it. Gently pull that through, and then go down. And so it's back of the fabric. Okay, so you can see how you can start building your pattern here. You can, you know, at this point go downwards or go straight up, or make your way backwards to where you started. Make a little kind of block. Whatever the design is that you're going to be following, you know, you just want to kind of be mindful of how much yarn you have on your needle. Do you need to cut it at some point and then start again with the needle, with the yarn from the ball, so you have enough, you know, yarn to work with. When you're done with this and you're ready to weave in your ends, you can go ahead and cut this yarn that goes to the ball. And then to secure this, it's pretty secure already, but you can weave this in the back here, along with the other cut end. And then you should eventually have something like this, you know. So I had a little woven end here, and I ended up having one, I think, in the middle here. So I kind of wove my ends in and then cut them when I felt like they were secure. And then the other thing to know about this is, because you're putting chunky yarn on chunky yarn in this example, or just yarn on top of yarn, it will be thicker here, so it's going to feel different than the rest of your gauge. But as long as your tension is fairly uniform and it matches what you'd already knitted pretty closely, it'll block out really well, as it'll match what the other yarn is doing. But if you pull really tight, you may have puckers or something like that. And if it's too loose, you may snag it. So that is just one thing to keep in mind with your tension, and make sure it's fairly flat when you're done, but not pulling too tight. Okay, so it's really simple. It's a lot about creativity and knowing the anatomy of what your stitch is. It's a little hard to write up in written words, and I'm not the greatest artist at drawing things out. So hopefully during the class, we'll be able to go through this over and over again and maybe make a design of your own choosing, or we can go ahead and follow the heart pattern and apply that onto a gauge swatch. All right, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you in class.